Okay, welcome to this video then on an Inspector Goole for your Inspector Calls GCSE English Literature exam with AQA. We know that this is probably the toughest question because there is no extract in the exam. We need to know the plot and characters. We also need to know some key quotes. If we don't know the quotes, we'll struggle to hit the marks for grade 5 for the language and structure analysis on the mark scheme. The purpose of this video, just like the previous ones, number one, some revision of the character of the inspector. Secondly, to know some key quotes. I'll give you my top 3. And thirdly, how to structure an answer to the question as well. So, who is the inspector then? Well, he arrives just as Mr. Burling is giving his speech about capitalism. The doorbell, in fact, interrupts the speech, which is a deliberate technique by Priestley, possibly to interject and push forward the socialist agenda. The inspector is a vehicle, we could say, for Priestley's moral message of responsibility and socialism. He already knows everything the inspector does. He doesn't seem to be looking for information. He already seems to know exactly what has happened, and he's there to make the characters confess their actions. He's described by Priestley in the stage directions as being not a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. He's a man in his 50s. He's dressed in a plain, darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. We get some real good idea of who the inspector is, about his character, just from those stage directions, which of course you can use as quotations in your exam as well. So my top 3 quotes then. Number 1 is this. There are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness entwined with our lives. In his final speech, the inspector addresses the entire family here, but more importantly, he addresses the audience as well, which he knows would be mostly capitalists because of the price of going to the theatre. The repetition of millions reinforces the audience, the sheer number of people who find themselves on the poverty line with no support. These are the people who need assistance. The introduction of John Smith is important here to illustrate that it's not just women who find themselves unemployed and with nowhere to turn. We know that Smith was the most popular, most common surname in England at the time, and John being the most popular and most common first name as well. It's used there to emphasise the sheer number of people that are in that situation. So Smith is an interesting use of surname. It might reflect how common it was for people to suffer. These people are all around us, perhaps. The listing at the end of the quote is important. The poorer people in society are the same as us. We all have hopes and dreams, fears and sufferings. The use of the word entwined demonstrates this absolutely perfectly. My second quote then is this. We don't live alone, we're members of one body, we're responsible for each other. The time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will learn it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. Again, from his final speech, Priestley uses a triplet of short, simple, declarative sentences to reinforce his message of socialism before the inspector's exit. Later in the quote, we see a threat that if people don't learn to be more responsible for one another, then a lesson will be learned in fire and blood and anguish. Priestley could be referring to World War I here. The telegraphic sentence at the end makes up the inspector's final words. There are no arrests. The inspector has achieved what he set out to achieve in having an impact on the characters, but also the audience. He's achieved his objective about educating that capitalist audience. It's almost a bit of a mic drop moment, his big finish before he walks out. My third quote is this. You've had children, you must have known what she was feeling, and you slammed the door in her face. He addresses Mrs. Burling directly in this quote through the repeated use of the pronoun. The triplet is also effective. That repetition of you is used 3 times to affect Mrs. Burling in an attempt to make her feel awful and responsible for her actions. The metaphor as well of slamming the door in her face is a powerful one here. Despite knowing the sort of existence that Eva had, Mrs. Burling was quite happy to refuse her any sort of charity. That sort of line would have had a real big impact on the audience. So how would that look as a paragraph? Let's have a look at this. Another what, how, why structure. How and why is Inspector Goole an important character? Well, what? The inspector is integral to the play as he is a vehicle for Priestley's moral message of socialism. Nice and straightforward. And how? We see this in his final speech when he addresses the characters collectively and reminding them that there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, and the quote continues. Priestley merges repetition and listing to get his point across. Notice how we're talking about two techniques in one go before the inspector's exit. The repetition of millions reinforces to the audience the sheer number of people who find themselves on the poverty line with no support. The listing at the end of this quote is important too. The poorer people in society are the same as us. We all have hopes and dreams, fears and sufferings. The use of that word entwined demonstrates it perfectly. The introduction of a John Smith is also important here to illustrate that it's not just women who find themselves unemployed with nowhere to turn. So that's how it might look as a paragraph, with the context all part of that and as embedded within the answer that we've given. Have a go now at using one of the other quotes. That's what I would do to form a paragraph like that. You can find the resources online at mrcrawfordenglish.com. You can click the link underneath the video, and you can also download some other resources from there as well. And on Instagram, I'll be posting daily revision to help you through the GCSE English Language and Literature exams. So make sure you follow the Instagram at Mr. Crawford ENG. Laters.